Parliament member, Nigel Farage, who says no one will be free and safe until we smarten up. In what way? What do we have to do to smarten up, Nigel?
Well, good afternoon. Well, the first thing we have to do is to recognise the mistakes of the past. Let's be absolutely frank and honest about this. We now have, within many European countries, and dare I say it, within the USA too, a fifth column living within our own countries, people, mercifully few in number, but people who are out to destroy, our whole civilization and our way of life. And of course, the really sinister thing about today is, what price now a cartoonist, a satirist, even a commentator? The implications on free speech and our democracy are very serious. So let's recognise the mistakes we've made. Uncontrolled immigration, just not knowing, in many cases, who the people were that were coming into our country. We have allowed, and I'm certainly speaking for Britain here, within our mosques, people coming in, heavily funded by some Middle Eastern states, pushing a deeply unpleasant and anti-Christian heritage culture. And we've also, and here's the biggest mistake that governments have made, we have promoted multiculturalism. We have promoted division within our societies. We have said to large numbers of people, you can come here from any part of the world. By the way, please don't bother to learn our language, don't integrate in any way at all. You can take over whole parts of our towns and cities, and we'll say it's made us a wonderful, diverse nation. That hasn't worked. So learn those mistakes from the past, and in going ahead from here, I think we've got to start being just a bit more assertive about who we are and what our values are. And I'm not saying that we should all, be forced to go to church on Sundays or anything like it, but we come from countries with Christian cultures and Christian constitutions, and it's about time we started standing up for that.
Nigel, you get a lot of grief back in Britain for your stance on watching for this growing immigration wave. But now I imagine maybe today, sadly, after these events, not as much. What are you saying? I mean, I had a detective just here, Pat Brosnan, who said you have to go right into those Muslim communities and weed out and search out the bad elements, or those who, for a better term, would rat out the guys who might have been behind this. And that's where they are. They're in those communities. But that is like profiling, in a sense. And that's a big hullabaloo in the United States. I'm sure it is in Britain. I'm sure it is in France.
Well, I mean, I know that, and of course, we've had a huge scandal, and I've spoken on your show in the past about the sexual grooming of underage girls that's taken place in many northern British cities. And I'm afraid that the vast majority, even 90% of these perpetrators, were men that had come to Britain from Pakistan. And the reason that the sexual preying on young girls reached the level that it did is that the politicians and the authorities were scared of using profiling to go in and deal with the problem for fear of being thought to be racist. Well, I think that after an attack like this, I think public opinion won't worry in quite the same way about profiling. I think the real fear that is going to be in people's minds in France and Britain and Germany and right across Europe today, the real fear is that what we saw here wasn't, a staged extravaganza. It wasn't the blowing up of a tube train. It wasn't the bombing of a commuter train, as we saw in Madrid a few years ago. This was a hit-and-run incident. And I've listened to your security guys speaking earlier, and it is frightening how easy it is for just a couple of guys to cause mayhem like this. So I think the atmosphere and the environment will say to the police and will say to all of our security services that actually there are no limits to where you've got to look now. This problem simply must be dealt with.
Now, I know we're going to be dealing with this later on this show, but this notion that if you offend Muhammad or joke about Muhammad or make any comical references to Islam in general, that is beyond the pale. Whereas you could put Jesus in a vat of urine, you can criticize Jews, but why and how do civilized societies then have to address this? How do they address this?
Well, Yeah, I mean, you're right. And I mean, you know, I'm speaking to you from London, where, of course, we have Buckingham Palace and the Queen. And however regal the Queen may be, it doesn't mean we can't draw cartoons about the Queen.
And
boy,
do you ever. Do you ever, yes.
Oh, well, I mean, well, in fact, we were doing it. We were doing it ever since George III lost North America. So we've got a long tradition of this. Neil, you're right. I mean, we get in a sense, don't we, here, to a clash of cultures. However, can I just say this? When we talked about the Muslim communities in Paris and the need to go in and out these bad guys, that does not mean that the vast majority of Muslims that are living in Britain, France, Germany and America are not law-abiding and peaceable and really good human beings who we'd be happy to have as our friends and our next-door neighbours. So let's be careful. Let's not stir up hatred against all Muslims. That in itself would be a terrible, terrible mistake. But what has happened, you know, within certain sections and elements of the Muslim community is the growth of this radical extremism. And I go back to my point, you know, how do we deal, as you say, with our tradition of parody, mockery and satirism against a small minority of people who think that even attempting to poke fun at their religious leader is beyond the pale? We can only do that by making it absolutely clear that anybody that comes to live in our countries, particularly new people that come to live in our countries, are coming to live in a culture where we are open and we are tolerant. That on its own does not deal with the existing problem we've got, and I acknowledge that. We will have many years of these difficulties ahead of us.
Nigel, well said. Always good seeing you, even under these circumstances, my friend. Nigel Farage. All right.